Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to chapters 7 and 8 of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief. We're finally figuring some things out. So, without further ado, let's get into the brief summary and then talk about things in a little more depth. So, Percy is finally starting to put two and two together, with some prompting from Annabeth, of course, and figuring out, hey, my dad was a god. In fact, everyone here is a demigod, or half-blood as they're called, with one parent a god, the other parent a mortal. Annabeth, for example, is a daughter of Athena, and an English professor. History professor? One of those. He's a professor. Also, she doesn't appreciate Percy just assuming that it's all the male gods having children. She says, get that out of your head. It's a balance of both. So, what does this mean? Well, it's just what people have to deal with. And truth be told, Annabeth is not exactly positive about this. When he asks who his father is, he says you're undetermined. And sometimes the gods just don't care enough to tell you who you are. And then his stomach rumbles, and Annabeth sends him back to Cabin 11 to have him think over things as she thinks over her own things. Other information she's given him, that she's been here since she was 7, and that a lot of demigods actually hang around camp year-round. Some of them head home after the summer, but a lot of them simply can't. It's too dangerous. There are the rare exceptions who never know they're demigods and continue existing in the world like nothing's happened. So it's a lot of information for poor Percy to try and deal with, especially since we're starting to get a hint of what's going on. Annabeth also admits that something seems to have been stolen from the new Mount Olympus, and, well, the gods are fighting. Back in Cabin 11, Percy takes a sit down, and Luke comes over saying, hey, found you a sleeping bag, also stole you some toiletries, which Percy appreciates, so he is curious about that whole stealing part. Especially since Luke then pulls out a switchblade and starts cleaning his sandals. He and Percy have a chat where Percy asks a little more about this whole quest thing and the big 3 gods. Luke steps around some of these, admitting though that the last quest that happened was his own. It got screwed up somehow, he doesn't talk about how, and ultimately Chiron has now allowed anyone else to go on a quest, stating that he's had a prophecy that a special kid has to come along first. Annabeth then has been assuming every new kid at camp is one of these special kids, and Luke tells Percy not to worry about it. It's a little hard. It's a little hard to do that. Really hard to do that. But hey, no time to dwell on all these uncomfortable truths. It is supper time. Cabin 11 and the entire camp head off to supper, including some water nymphs and some tree nymphs and the satyrs, and it's just a really big party where everyone makes sure to pop part of their dinner into the fire at the center of the hall as a burnt offering to the gods. And then we get real camp-like. Everyone happily goes off to a sing-along before heading to bed. Which, I mean, I've been at camp before, and there's at least some kids who don't want to do the sing-along. So, I mean, these kids who range from, like, literal kids to teenagers going into college, cool. You all have a sing-along everyone's enjoying, fine, go for it. Let's have a sing-along. So, a shorter chapter, a little bit, then followed by, again, one of those more action-packed chapters, which is chapter 8. Percy is kind of getting used to a routine, though it is sort of a flexible routine. First and foremost, in the mornings, he spends it with Annabeth, learning ancient Greek. that he is kind of handling okay. But then the rest of the day is spent going from activity to activity, trying to figure out what he's good at, which doesn't seem much of anything. He's certainly not good at archery, though Chiron forgives him for almost hitting him with an arrow, having to detangle it from his tail. He's not good at foot racing, and Clarice constantly beats him at wrestling, and he's kind of good at canoeing, but what good is that? And Percy does sort of feel the pressure of this. He recognizes a lot of the older folks at camp, including Luke, are watching him to try and figure out who he is and what he's good at. He feels a little of the pressure, but he's also just trying new things, which is interesting. The big thing of trying new that we get is him at sword practice with Cabin 11. Luke takes him on as a partner, and it turns out Luke is very good at sword fighting, and Percy proceeds to get soundly bopped around. However, he sees Luke pour some ice water over himself, follows suit, and gets rejuvenized to the point where he actually disarms Luke a grand total of once, and Luke notes that if he actually had a proper sword balanced to him, he could cause some real damage. I mean, this is camp. This is camp. Percy and Grover later have a sit-down where they talk over a few more things. First and foremost, Percy is wondering how the conversation with Mr. D went for Grover, and Grover admits that Mr. D has put off judgment, stating that with Percy Jackson, it hasn't really been decided whether or not Grover was a success or a failure. So if Percy ever has a quest, Grover will have to go on it and see if he can protect him then. Percy's just kind of like, what? And Grover's like, no, it's fine. You won't ever be sent on a quest, and if you were, you wouldn't want me. And just, there's a lot of emotions. But understandable emotions. The other subjects they actually cover in this conversation include the empty cabins, of which there are 4. Artemis has an empty cabin because she is an eternal maiden. We'll find more about the Hunters of Artemis in later books, but if you're curious, she does accept ladies who, again, swear to be maidens, and they just hang out. The cabin is there sort of as a symbolic thing because Artemis would be mad if she didn't have one. Same with Hera. Hera is the goddess of marriage, so having a lot of bastard children doesn't quite suit her. Symbolic cabin. The other 2 that don't have anybody is connected to a cabin that is not here. We are also missing a Hades cabin. You see, Hades does not have his own throne on Mount Olympus. He is not considered one of the 12 Olympians. Hades and Hestia are the major 2. Hestia is always tending the fire, having supposedly given up her throne to Dionysus, Mr. D. Hades, though, he's in the underworld, he's hanging out doing his own thing, so he doesn't have a cabin, and he doesn't have a throne. It doesn't seem to be a problem, though, because most kids of Hades don't seem to come through Camp Half-Blood. In fact, they were constantly at war with the children of Poseidon and the children of Zeus, the Big 3, as they're called. So Zeus and Poseidon's cabins are now empty because following World War II, which was a massive disaster when it came to demigods, the Big 3 gods swore off ever having children. Percy's kind of like, is that true? And Grover has to be like, no. Like, no. You see, it turns out Zeus fell off the wagon. Grover's words, not mine, and ended up having a child with this TV starlet, a girl named Thalia. Now, Thalia was a sweet girl who ultimately sacrificed herself for some demigods and a satyr as they were fleeing to camp. They got all the way to the nearby hill when they were attacked by hellhounds and the Furies, the 3 kindly ones. Thalia sacrificed herself so that the other 3 could flee to safety, and Zeus showed her mercy by turning her into a pine tree, and the pine tree is a protective force for the camp now. Since then, there have been no official children of the big three gods, and notably those hellhounds and furies were sent by Hades to kill Thalia. So, really shouldn't have kids of the big three. Ooh, just wait, just wait. All these deep conversations ultimately move into Friday night Capture the Flag. Turns out Capture the Flag at Camp Half-Blood uses real weapons, and it's time to beat each other silly. Percy is given border patrol. He's on the Athena team with Apollo and Hermes cabins against everybody else, but mainly against Ares. He's told to stand by the creek and guard the border against the red team until Clarice and 4 of her cabin mates come crashing through to beat the ever-living daylights out of him. He is soundly getting destroyed until he falls into the creek. The water revitalizes him, and he soundly beats the 5 people, breaking the spear of Clarice. Just in time for Luke to come running through with the flag, with everybody cheering behind him, and both Clarice and Percy realize he was bait. He was literally a distraction. Percy confronts Annabeth when she suddenly appears out of nowhere, feeling a little used, which she reassures that she was on her way to help, but he didn't even need it. He handled it on his own. It turns out the water's also healing him, which is good because then a hellhound attacks him, probably scrapes him up pretty badly until Chiron kills him. Annabeth tells Percy to get into the water, and while he is healing up, Poseidon's sign, a green trident, shows up above his head. Poseidon now claiming his son Perseus Jackson, which Chiron promptly announces to everybody, and Percy's just like, I'm who? Oh yeah, no, this is a fascinating set of chapters because of all those little details again. Just like the sheer number of stories happening here that we're just getting the threads of. It's really unique because we're meeting all these characters who have their own stories, who understandably don't feel like immediately sharing them right away with somebody like Percy, who's just shown up at most 5 days ago. It's private, it's personal. Like, Percy asks some really uncomfortable questions. Understandably on his side as well, he is trying to figure out what's going on. But everybody's only willing to share so much. Part of it is this border, and it is either them telling Percy to back off, which Annabeth does, or Percy, figuring things out. There is a point where he's talking with Luke that he says, I stayed silent, so if Luke wanted to say anything more, he could. Evidently he didn't want to. Like, Percy's starting to get it. And he's starting to get it in a lot of ways. So as these chapters go on, you realize he pushes less and less. Like, he pushes most with Annabeth as he's putting together the pieces and figuring out that these people are children of the gods. Because he asks some poorly worded questions, like, well, who is your father? And Annabeth's just like, don't just assume it's all the fathers that are gods. There are female goddesses. They sleep around too. Aphrodite? Me saying Aphrodite. Annabeth does not point to Aphrodite, but Aphrodite. 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 That's sort of the first big misstep he takes, and then the second one is him asking Annabeth why she came to camp so young, when she says she's been here since she was 7. And Annabeth, like, shuts him down entirely, like, that is none of your business. It's clicking with him. He makes these mistakes with Annabeth, one, because he is just information overload right now, trying to put things together. And two, does sort of feel like he has this connection with her, because he does go on to ask other questions, but he's more careful in his wording. Particularly trying to ask around when she was taking care of him and asking him about the summer solstice. And the key Percy figures out here is to offer information as well as trying to figure out information. So she goes, so you do know something, and he says, this is all I know, this is how I know it. I heard Chiron, Mr. Brunner, and Grover talking about the summer solstice. So then this opens Annabeth to respond with information. But they're also talking then on a subject that is not overly personal. And that's the other key that Percy sort of figures out, is not to push on the overly personal things. To ask around it, to ask about the big events, and then let the person fill in those personal moments if they want to. And this becomes key to understanding sort of the story beats that we're getting from everybody else, the little pieces of stories that we get from Annabeth, Luke, Grover, people like that, right? So we find out some big event beats, such as there is a modern Mount Olympus. It's on the Empire State Building. Something was stolen. So we're starting to connect things. Summer solstice then is the deadline. The deadline for whatever was stolen to be returned. Well, obviously, winter solstice was likely the event where the thing was stolen. Okay? We can then infer that the gods blame each other, but are assuming that probably one of the demigods was a servant to their godly parent on this one. aka it happened in an event where the demigods were taken to visit the gods. We can piece things together ourselves. But some things we can't. We simply don't have enough information. But Riordan is doing a really cool trick here and helping build these characters up and giving us motivation to keep reading. For example, when it comes to Luke. Percy has this brief conversation with Luke where Luke admits that after he screwed up his quest, it kind of screwed everybody else over because Chiron won't let anybody else go on a quest. Luke doesn't offer any more than that, and Percy doesn't push. Which is understandable. He does ask some other questions that are still pretty uncomfortable, but he does it in such a way that he accepts the answer he's being given without significantly arguing for more information. With Luke, he asks, "Have you ever met your father?" Luke says, "Yes, once." Percy wonders about some things, including whether or not this meeting is ultimately what scarred Luke, but he doesn't say that. He never once asks Luke about the scar. As you track these conversations happening, you'll actually notice there is a basic theme. Percy is trying to figure out what is going on with the Big Three and children of the Big Three and the Oracle. Going into the conversation with Luke, he mentions the conversation he had with Annabeth about wondering if he was Big Three material. He also quotes Clarice on that one. She asked if he was Big Three material. And then Annabeth saying he should talk to the Oracle. These are sort of the subjects he's trying to figure out. Luke then helps explain why Annabeth is pushing the way she is, but we never get a direct answer for these questions. And we don't get a direct answer for these questions until Percy sits down with Grover. And the conversation sits differently there, because Grover and Percy are friends who've known each other for about a year now. So Percy is a friend going into this conversation. He's not purely selfish, trying to figure out information he's missing. He honestly wants to know, how did the conversation go with Mr. D? He is actively thinking about the information he's been given before and using it in later conversations. Like, Grover's like, Chiron told you I wanted a searcher's license, and Percy's like, no, he told me you had goals you were aiming for. And Grover doesn't mention the searcher's license anymore. We don't actively know what that is. But overall, that's not super important to the conversation. And Percy's figured out not to hook on to everything. He's just trying to figure out the big beats, while still having honest conversations with these people about their own lives, without pushing too far. So when Grover doesn't give any more on the searcher's license, Percy again doesn't push. He lets the conversation go, ultimately trying to reassure Grover that he trusts him and is still his friend, that he believes he has talents and would take him on a quest should he ever get one. But ultimately, they end up discussing the gods more. And Percy again goes back to the big three. He is trying to understand the system he's been put in, and how it might affect things, and why people are looking at him so strangely. Well, if he is big three material, it means that one of the gods fell off the wagon again, and it's just a question of who. A lot of people assume it's Zeus. Zeus is sort of the big one that has a lot of myths. But a lot of people forget that Poseidon himself is also... That's the interesting thing about Hades. You see, Hades has the one myth that most people know, which is Hades and Persephone. Which, don't get me wrong, kidnapping your future wife, not a good plan. But in comparison to his brothers Zeus and Poseidon, Hades focused at least on another god, married her, made her queen of the underworld, and accepts the fact that for half of the year she's going to be hanging out in the overworld, the not the underworld. By most accounts, Persephone and Hades, as they show up in ancientness, are actually a relatively loving couple. Like, Persephone has no problem being queen of Hades. A lot of the newer myths paint that image very differently. But the old myths, Persephone's happy-ish, kind of. So overall, the stronger possibility is Zeus or Poseidon, and we actually find out Percy is a kid of Poseidon. But it's not easy right from the get-go. The fact is that a hellhound got into the camp. We've already been told that this only happens in two ways. One, the camp has officially stalked them in the forest. We get the sense that this is not true because Chiron immediately responds to this hellhound, not by sending the students after it, by actually attacking it himself. Which, can I just say, proactive teacher that we don't see in most school camp-style books. Like, good on you, Chiron, actually getting involved here. But the other thing is that it could have been summoned by somebody inside the camp, which gives us a sense that there is an enemy here that we just can't identify yet. Clarice blames Percy when Percy was the one attacked by it, so she almost draws suspicion to herself on that one, being she doth protest too much, I believe. But part of it goes deeper than that. We have seen several demigods in this camp already who Percy understands why they might be bitter and upset. Annabeth is the one who tells him that sometimes the gods just don't care. Which you're not really expecting to hear from Annabeth. Because she seems to be the quintessential, let's do this, Athena always has a plan, a style person. So for her to, like, very viciously say, sometimes the gods just don't care. But Luke also gets to be bitter at points, which Percy recognizes really doesn't fit with his personality. He tends to be sort of more gung-ho, let's have fun, but maybe that's because they're all extended family. So what if the gods don't care? I'll take care of you guys. Percy kind of gets it. The longer he goes without knowing his father, the more it's sort of like, this just isn't fair. You have us and then abandon us. So there does seem to be some anger here, which I think is understandable. But it then is spilling out towards the kids of those gods, which can be the really dangerous part. The camera's tilted because my cat has come to play, as always, when I'm trying to do these videos. Unless she's napping right over there, she's gotta be on the book. So ultimately, we actually get a story happening that includes many stories of its own in between. Some of which we're going to get more information on, but others, it's just world building. We don't get extensive information about what happened during World War II, just that it was a lot of children of Poseidon and Zeus versus the children of Hades. That ultimately destroyed a huge portion of that demigod population and the world in general. Having the world really affected by these characters suddenly gives us a sense of how big all of this is. Which is really important in these couple of chapters because the summer camp feels like it's such an area set aside for half-bloods. It's their own little world where the rest of the world doesn't affect them and they don't affect the rest of the world. But we're getting hints that that's not true. This style of life can be absolutely devastating for the people who are half-bloods and the people who aren't. So Percy now has to be really careful. He has to make sure that he's not being insensitive to those around him. Tiggs, over here. Not being insensitive to those around him, but also getting the information he needs and watching out for himself far more than he's expecting other people to do. The fact that Annabeth used him as bait to bait Clarice, he was not expecting that. He's probably not going to forget about it for a very long time. You were knocking my camera around. I had to do something, silly. I'm not sure this is going to work really well. So I think I'll call it for today and keep reading. I hope you do too, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.